today is Susan Henry, and she's an associate professor here at Glendale Community College, and you've taught here for a number of years.
22.
Count them, 22 years. And I'm assuming many of you have her or are having her as a professor right now, so this is wonderful. She's going to talk to you about the Titanic. Did any of you go to the luncheon? Did any of you do the Titanic, the last meal on the so some of you did, right? Oh yes, so the last meal that was served on the Titanic before it went down. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Henry, and if you need these, let me know, and sit back and enjoy.
Thank you. It's an honor for me to be introduced by Dr. Gillooly, whom I have admired for many years. Thank you for coming. It's such a leisurely time of year. I know you don't have a whole lot to do, right? I hope you all have your boarding passes. If you don't, it's okay. Take a look at the name on the back of your boarding pass. That is indeed the name of a real Titanic passenger. Now, at the end of the lecture, you'll be able to find out. Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, okay. At the very end of the lecture, you'll be able to find out if you survive the sinking of the Titanic. Now, I want you to promise me one thing. Please take these with you. They make good bookmarks, or you can recycle it or whatever, but just don't leave it here. I don't want this lecture hall to look like the North Atlantic on April 15th, 1912, with debris scattered everywhere, bodies and deck chairs and things like that. And by the way, this boarding pass thing was not my idea. If you have been to the exhibit, Titanic, the artifact exhibit, have any of you seen that wonderful exhibit?
Where's that?
Well, I'll talk about that later. It's right now, it's in, of all places, Las Vegas, the Luxor. So if you were about due for a trip to Las Vegas anyway, that's what you can do. It wasn't my idea. That was part of that very interactive exhibit. So, why are we so obsessed with this event that took place 100 years ago? There have been other shipwrecks. There have been other disasters, natural and man-made. This one, for some reason, has really captured our imagination. Let me start by asking you a question. The Titanic sank on April 15th, 1912. How long do you think it was before there was a film that a movie that people could go to the theaters and watch? Couple decades? Couple years? 29 days is all it took. 29 days after the Titanic sank, there was a movie. It was called Saved from the Titanic. And that same year, there were many others made too. They were all silent, of course, because this is 1912. And they all looked like they were filmed in a bathtub, but people were very interested. And now you may know this, on the anniversary of the sinking, which is April 15th, 2012, James Cameron is bringing out his big blockbuster film again. It is being reissued in 3D, you guessed it. Titanic in 3D, I can't wait. And there's another miniseries coming up too, we'll talk about that. Now, I want you to know there are people who know the Titanic from bow to stern. They know how many rivets were in the hull. They know how many whiskers were in Captain Smith's beard that night. I'm not one of those people. Those people may be in the room right now, which is an intimidating prospect for me. I am just an English teacher who observed a pattern, but I think you will find it an interesting pattern. Look at this photo. What do you see?
Iceberg.
An iceberg, but it's not just any iceberg. According to my sources, this is almost certainly the iceberg. This was photographed by someone on another ship a few hours after the impact. This person did not know about the Titanic disaster, but he did notice that there was a swath of red paint around the base of the iceberg, which meant that it had which could have only happened really, through the impact with a ship. So he took a photo of it, and there it is.
small, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know what the perspective is here. I'd like to place a little human person next to it to see the little dime or whatever. Disasters. Are we interested in them? Sure. We feel terrible about them. We feel very bad for the people in the Midwest right now with the tornadoes. It's not over. I understand there are more coming, but we're still interested. We still want to see. Some disasters we respect. Some disasters we exploit. And the Titanic is one of the ones that we exploit. It's fun as long as we're in the comfort of a movie theater or in our own homes. When the Culinary Arts Department put on the Titanic luncheon last week, and by the way, this is one of their most, they do it periodically, and this is one of their most popular menus, and it's partly because the food is so good, but it's also, I think, partly because we enjoy sitting there saying, wow, this is what they ate just a few hours before the ship sank. And as long as we're on dry land, while we're eating that meal, everything's fine. Now, one of the first of the many, many ironies of this story, I noticed there was salmon on the menu. So dinner time Sunday, the passengers were eating fish. A few hours later, the tables were turned, you might say. Yeah, sorry. Now, I never thought I would be quoting Kurt Russell in my academic talk, but this actor who starred in Poseidon, which is the remake of the Poseidon Adventure, had this to say about the appeal of disasters, and I think it's pretty true. It gives you a kind of a simple, primal sense of who's going to make it, who's not going to make it. And you sort of begin to associate with certain characters. You say, I'm like that person. I hope I would behave like that person in that situation. Then, when something horrible or deathly happens to that person, you switch your allegiance. The audience goes, whoops, maybe I don't want to be that person. You pick a survivor. You want to survive, right? You're watching the movie and you say, gosh, what would I do if I were in that situation? Now, the people who build roller coasters. Actually, I changed my mind. Thank you. I forgot something. Thank you, Jessica. Dr. Galuli. The people who build roller coasters have a little motto, and that motto, and other extreme rides, that motto is fear minus danger equals fun. So, you can get tossed all over the place, and as long as you're reasonably sure you're going to be okay, it's fun. Not for all of us, but for a lot of us. And I think that's why we like learning about disasters. Okay, this event has a tremendous legacy. Books, of course, plenty of nonfiction books, accounts of the sinking, very detailed, but also it's been worked into fiction as well. I think, I'm told and I believe that no other single day event in history has been fictionalized as often as the Titanic. There have been poems, famous one by Thomas Hardy called The Convergence of the Twain. The convergence of the twain is just a fancy way of saying when two big things came together. The two big things, of course, being the ship and the iceberg. Songs, right from the beginning, popular songs, folk songs that found their way around the campfire. Certainly films, several in 1912, as I said. The first big Hollywood production was in 1953. It was called Titanic, in which Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb are dissolving their marriage, and they're fighting over whether to keep the kids in England or to take them back to Mackinac, Michigan. And the problem sort of gets solved for them, if you know what I mean. In 1958, but I promise not too many spoilers today, okay? In 1958, there was a film called A Night to Remember, based on a book. This was a British film, and it was much more factual. It was much less of a soap opera. And then, of course, the big one in 1997, James Cameron's Titanic. That is a film that I think is about 92% perfect. Occasionally, the dialogue is a little lame and predictable, wouldn't you say? But the design and the special effects, I think, are without compare. Television, sure. There was a real good miniseries in 1996, Hallmark Hall of Fame, and there's another miniseries being produced right now by British Television, which ABC has picked up, 4 parts, and we are to see that right around the anniversary of the sinking, so watch for that. There have been plays, Titanic the musical, do you know about that? Titanic the musical, sure, by Maury Yeston and Peter Stone. It had a nice long run on Broadway and won Tony Awards, including Best Musical. It didn't tour, however, because the set was too expensive. They had this nice slanty effect going in Act 2, where the deck would just dip more and more and things would go sliding off, and they just couldn't take that on tour. Jokes. Entire chapters of joke books are dedicated to the Titanic, and I will tell none of them today. A lot of them, you can look them up, a lot of them perpetuate stereotypes, as you know. And games. There was a board game, the object of which was to get up to A deck and get into a lifeboat. And there are a couple online games. You can play them for free. I was playing one the other day where you get to go down and bring little bits of treasure up to the surface. What does good fiction have? Good fiction has an engaging plot. Lots of ups and downs, not, figuratively speaking, and literally in this case. Lots of colorful figures, characters, different from each other, old, young, evil, noble. Some you like, some you don't. Some act very heroically in the crisis, and some do just the opposite. There has to be an intriguing setting. Setting, as you know, is where and when. And we've got one here. There have to be symbols. They don't have to be, but it helps if there are symbols, concrete things representing non-concrete things. And of course, irony. Irony helps. Irony, as you know, is when you get precisely the opposite of what you had expected. Let me just list a few here. The Titanic was the biggest, the fastest, the most luxurious ocean liner, and it sank. What did they say about it? It's unsinkable, and of course it sank. By the way, the White Star Line did not say that. That was not their official line, as we'll see. If they had not seen the iceberg, what would have happened? They would have slammed right into it. 1 or 2 watertight compartments would have been damaged with a head-on collision. The ship probably would have stayed afloat. But they saw it just in time to make a sharp right. It still didn't work. And so, 4, maybe 5 watertight compartments were damaged. Too much water, too much weight. It pulled the boat down. That just kills me. The nearest ship to the Titanic at the time, about 10 or 12 miles away. And anyone know what it was called? Not the Carpathia, the Californian. The Californian was close, but I think their wireless operator had just turned off his set and gone to bed. And so the Titanic sent up rockets, but the Californian thought that these were just the colored rockets that identified it as a White Star Liner. They thought the Titanic was just saying hi, not help.
Not bye. Not bye.
Okay, not bye, right. What do you call it when a fiction writer gives you a little hint of what's to come later? Mm-hmm. We got some good foreshadowing in this story. In 1898, there was a novel published by Morgan Robertson. It was called Futility. And this was a book about, mind you, this was before the Titanic was designed or built or anything. It was about a fabulous Atlantic liner, the biggest ever. Many rich and famous people were aboard. It was the same size as the Titanic and went about the same speed and carried about the same number of passengers. And like the Titanic, it had lifeboats for only half that number. Both of these boats were called Unsinkable. This fictitious boat in Futility hit an iceberg on an April night and was wrecked with great loss of life. What do you think the name of this fictitious boat was? Titan. Very good. Titan. Right. Coincidence? Probably. Both of the names, of course, are an allusion to Greek mythology. Titans were very immense, large, impressive creatures, as were the boats. So there's a little foreshadowing for you in fiction, and then in real life there was some too. Just as the Titanic left the dock at Southampton, a smaller liner called the New York got sucked into its wake because the Titanic was so big, it created such a powerful wake, and the New York almost rammed into the Titanic, came within about 3 or 4 feet. And somehow they managed to slow it down and push it away. But it was not an auspicious beginning to a voyage, to an ocean voyage. Let's take a look at some of the facts about this ship. It was known as RMS Titanic. That means Royal Mail Steamer. It was authorized to carry mail, British mail, to the United States. It had a sister ship, the Olympic, almost as big but not quite. The Olympic is not to be confused with the Olympia, which is the boat that brought my parents to the United States in 1956. That one's still not sailing anymore. The Titanic was 882 feet long, and its height was 175 feet. That is from the keel at the bottom to the top of the funnels. A little fun fact about those 4 funnels, only 3 of them were operational. The 4th one was just for show, just to give the illusion of size and power. So when you see paintings of the Titanic, sometimes you'll see correctly steam's coming out of the first 3, but not the last one. The White Star Line said that this boat was practically unsinkable. Maybe the press, maybe just the word on the street was that it was unsinkable. And that famous line, what's the famous line? Starts with God. God himself could not sink this ship, was not necessarily uttered by Bruce Ismay, the head of the White Star Line. We're not really sure. What the White Star Line did brag about, and which was true, is that the Titanic was at the time the largest moving object in the world. Impressive. Here are some facts about the voyage itself. You know most of these. The Titanic left Southampton, southwest England, on April 10th. 2,207 people aboard. They made stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland. Queenstown has since changed its name to Cove. It's pronounced Cove. Well, about 11:42 p.m. on the 14th, they were moving at 22.5 knots, practically its top speed. And they struck an iceberg on the starboard side, which is, of course, the right side of the ship. And 4 or 5 watertight compartments were damaged, and that was bad news. About 2 hours and, 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the ship disappeared below the water, and there's the number of people who were lost, 1,517. Some of them drowned, but most of them, as you know, just froze to death in the water. The water was 28 degrees that night. Another irony, it was not stormy, it was not cloudy, there were not a lot of waves, the ocean was very still that night. There was no moon, so it was pretty dark, and supposedly there was this beautiful, gorgeous backdrop of stars, like a Christmas card. The Carpathia, which was the only ship that was nearby to respond in any amount of time, picked up the first lifeboat at 4:10 a.m. Have to have conflict in our story. It's not interesting unless there are 2 things pushing together like this or pulling apart. And since literature is written by human beings, most of the time on one side of this conflict is humans. It could be sometimes on both sides, one person versus another person. It could be humans versus nature. The humans built the Titanic, but unfortunately it was no match for the iceberg, which is nature. It could be humans versus machine. That's a common conflict. Both of these are common conflicts in literature. In this case, you look at it a different way. The people built the ship and put their confidence in it, but the ship let them down. It could be humans versus fate. So many things went wrong that night. There are so many what ifs. What if they had seen the iceberg at the right time? What if they had had enough lifeboats? What if the Californian had interpreted the rockets correctly? And many, many more. So you get the impression that it was just fated to happen, because if only one of those things had gone right, there would have been much less loss of life. But no, every single one went wrong. There's a kind of a class conflict too, as you know. The upper class, the first class, they were already on the top deck, so they had first access to the lifeboats. Yes, some of the steerage passengers were locked in the decks below, which is pretty sad. And then a conflict which is central to almost any story, chaos versus order. I think it's central to life. I think life is pretty much constant chaos, isn't it? And it's just a matter of moment to moment deciding how much order am I going to try and impose on this chaos? How much energy do I want to put out here? And so if you're on the deck of the Titanic and you know the ship is sinking, you're saying to yourself, okay, shall I be polite, well-brought-up person? Shall I stand in line? Shall I follow the orders of the crew? Should I obey the women and children first thing? Or do I just get my butt on a lifeboat as quickly as I can and try and live through this ordeal? And other conflicts too. Setting. Where? 400 miles south of Cape Race, Newfoundland. And then just about the same distance east of Halifax, Nova Scotia. So nothing around. And the sea, as many of you know, is very intimidating. You don't know where it ends. You don't know how deep it was. Although, in case you're wondering, 2.5 miles on that spot. You don't know how well you're going to stay afloat. It's pretty scary. The when is interesting too. 1912, 1900, thereabouts, is seen as, there was an era in American history called the Gilded Age. Not golden, but gilded. Many advancements, higher standard of living, a lot to be proud of. And at the same time, the British had the Victorian Age, which was a high point for them in many ways. And the Victorian Age didn't properly end till right about this time, even though Victoria herself died in 1901. I'm fond of telling my students that in the year 1900, the British controlled 25% of the dry land in the earth. 25% of the landmass was under British control. I think that's too much for a little tiny island nation way up there. And so it's possible that this is the moment. This can be isolated when the Titanic goes down, because it was a British ship and a product of British pride. I should say right here, everyone who knows me knows that I love the British. I adore the British. But it's possible that at this point their collective pride had just gotten ahead of them. And as you know, in the first half of the 20th century, the empire declined and, became a shadow of itself after all. And it was sort of the end of the class mentality, the class boundaries that you see operating in this story. These class boundaries were very inviolable in the 19th century and became less so, became more permeable in the 20th century. So a lot of people think that the 19th century ended that night. Well, we talked about foreshadowing. This is plot, okay? One of the many elements of literature. You can think of it in terms of rising and falling. There's always a pattern of order, and then chaos, and then modified order. If it's a comedy, it's order, chaos, perfect order again. If it's a tragedy, it's order, chaos, and then a different kind of order. Think Macbeth or Hamlet. Things aren't perfect, but at least we've got them under control for now. So with this story, we've got the anticipation. Biggest ship ever, very luxurious. Let's go to America. Celebration, we did it. We're on board. The calm before the storm. And I put storm in quotation marks because there was no storm that night. But by this time, by the third, fourth day, people had settled into the routine of shipboard life. Many of them were asleep when the ship struck the iceberg. And then, of course, when the ship strikes the iceberg, crisis. And then when you realize there are not enough lifeboats on board, more crisis. And it gets pretty bad. And we come to that point a word we English teachers love to say, the denouement, the moment of highest drama, the climax, as it were. And then that, of course, is the moment that the ship disappears. It really happened. The reality sinks in. The Titanic is gone, and everybody who was left on board is gone with her. And then the resolution. The short-term resolution would be the rescue, and then the long-term is the aftermath, including inquests and hearings on both sides of the Atlantic, which destroyed a few careers. This is an interesting little chart here. You got to have our charts and graphs, so here's one of mine. This is the percentage of people who were saved. One of the myths of the Titanic is that all the first-class people got off and all the steerage people went down, and that's, of course, not true. But you can sort of see diminishing returns here. 60% of the first class, 44% of the second class, and about a quarter each of the third class and the crew. And we can further break this down to women and children versus men. I think this is even more interesting. Almost all the women and children on first class were rescued, only 31% of the men, 81% of the second class women, only 10% of the men. With third class, we're down to fewer than half of the women, and interestingly, 14% of the men. And the crew, that 87% of female crew members looks very high, but remember, there weren't that many female crew members. Most of them were men, and 22% of them made it. One more thing about those lifeboats. Supposedly, the Titanic did have enough lifeboats for a ship its size, but that was according to an outdated code. When this code was created, they couldn't conceive of a ship of that square footage or whatever carrying that many passengers. So yes, it had enough boats for a ship its size, but by this time, not enough for the number of people it carried. I'm going to stop here and ask for questions. Is there anything I have neglected to mention so far that you'd like to know? We'll have time for questions later. Yes? Say that again? How did who? The people who actually boarded it? I do not know, but I imagine they had to walk or ride a horse or ride a very primitive automobile to the White Star Line office or to what the 1912 equivalents of travel agencies and pay cash and get that piece of paper. Except for Jack Dawson, of course, how did he get his ticket? He won it in a poker game. Of course, if you haven't seen the Cameron film, that's how it begins. That's the best answer I can give to that. Sorry? Oh, no, Cameron was not a passenger. Cameron was the director of the film. Is. Oh, Jack Dawson. Well, I said no spoilers today, didn't I? You know me. I outlaw these in my class. Certainly I'm not going to do it here. Let's talk about tragedy in the traditional sense, the Greek sense. That's why the Parthenon. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. I was going to write the bigger they are, the faster they sink, but it turns out that's not true. The larger craft sink slower. The smaller craft go right down. The tradition of tragedy, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, less so now, is that it's not truly tragic unless the tragic hero is very successful, very rich, very powerful, very good-looking, or whatever to begin with. Somebody who just has it made. And then, of course, the tragedy is greater and it affects more people. Every tragic hero has a tragic flaw. A personality quality that's sort of an Achilles heel, you might say. Hamlet couldn't make up his mind, couldn't act. Othello had just the opposite problem. He acted too rashly, and so on. If the tragic hero is indeed the British Empire, what would you say their tragic flaw was?
Pride.
Pride, you guessed it. Pride. Maybe excessive pride, what the Greeks call hubris. And maybe that was the reason that they did not put more lifeboats on board, because they were so sure that this ship would not sink. But the best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry, as the poet Robert Burns once said. There are many interesting characters associated with this story. Now, as I call your name, if you are here, please identify yourself. I'd like to see you. Is Captain Smith here? Captain Smith, if you're here, please make yourself known. I guess not. Well, it's fitting, of course, that he's not here because the captain always goes down with the ship, or at very least, he's the last one off. And we're not sure how Captain Smith died, but his body was never recovered. Oh, by the way, you want to identify yourselves because I have prizes. My two favorite characters will get a prize. This is a bar of Vinolia soap. Now, this is good stuff. It's been around since 1912, and this, I'm told, was the... it's good. You want to. This was the soap that the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic found in their staterooms. You can still get it. And I guess the company that makes it is proud enough of its association with the Titanic that they now have a picture of the ship on the package, okay? So my two favorite characters, which not including Captain Smith, unfortunately, will get a bar of Vinolia soap. Put that right there. Captain Smith was 62 years old when the Titanic sank. He had been with the White Star Line since age 30, and he was known as the millionaire's captain. In fact, some rich people, he really knew how to run an elegant ship. Some rich people would not sail unless Captain Smith was in charge. His specialty was taking boats out for their maiden voyages. And he was ready to retire. He was ready to go back to England and spend time with his grandchildren. And then they talked him into sailing the Titanic. Some sources say he had already retired. And they coaxed him back out of retirement, which is really ironic. Colonel John Jacob Astor. I think your boarding pass says Colonel J.J. Astor or Astor Colonel J.J. Okay, here he is, the richest man on board. The richest man on board and arguably not very arguably, one of the richest men in the country. The Astors had been wealthy for a couple hundred years. They made their fortune, since the colonial times, they made their fortune in fur, real estate, and the biggest cash crop of the 17th century, opium. Mm-hmm. Astor, as you know, built the Astoria Hotel, and then he merged it with his friend Mr. Waldorf's hotel. So now we have the Waldorf Astoria. John Jacob Astor did not survive. He gallantly stepped back after he put his wife aboard. Is Madeline here? Is Mrs. Oh, Madeline's here. Okay. Madeline, did you know you were 7 months pregnant? Yeah. Madeline survived, and she had her baby a few months later, and she named it after his father. It was a scandal, of course, because he had just divorced his first wife and the mother of his other children and married Madeline, and this was big news in those days, and they were about 30 years apart. So there was a lot to talk about here. Now, you know this person. What I learned from researching this talk is that she was not called Molly in her life. She was Margaret Brown. Is Margaret Brown here? I think your boarding pass says Mrs. J.J. Brown. She also married a J.J. There she is, Margaret Brown. Okay. Margaret Brown, you're one of my favorites, so you get the soap. Can you pass the soap back to her? Thank you. Well, you'll see. She was from a town called Hannibal, Missouri, the same town where Mark Twain grew up, although not at the same time. And she moved to Leadville, Colorado when she was a young woman. She married J.J. Brown, who had nothing, but they didn't strike gold. They didn't have a gold mine. He was an engineer, and he invented a machine for extracting the ore from the mines. So they gave them a very large share of the silver mine, and suddenly Molly and JJ had a lot of money. She's usually portrayed in the movies as very kind, very down-to-earth person surrounded by all these snooty rich people. And she wound up in the famous lifeboat number 6, which was mostly full of women, with Quartermaster Robert Hitchens at the helm, if they have a helm. Lifeboats have a helm? I don't think so. In control. And Margaret Brown and Quartermaster Hitchens kind of got into it over whether to row back and try to pick up some of the people in the water. You may know that only a very few number of people were pulled out of the water and into the lifeboats. I'm not sure if they were able to do that or not. She became a philanthropist later in life. She started a fund for the survivors of the Titanic, at least the ones who weren't filthy rich to begin with. She started a literacy program, and she started in Leadville, Colorado, the first juvenile court, which became sort of a prototype and a model for other juvenile courts in other cities. The concept was unknown at the time. I like Molly Brown because she's the one who got me interested in the Titanic. When I was 6 or 7, I saw the movie The Unsinkable Molly Brown. And one of the later scenes in this movie is that moment when the boat sinks, and she's so brave, and she's getting all the women to row, and she's teaching them to sing a song, anything to keep them warm and to keep the morale up. Isidore and Ida Strauss. Are Mr. and Mrs. Strauss present? Oh, good. It's good that you're close together because in life you were inseparable. Even when you were apart, you were always writing letters to each other. These two were co-owners of Macy's department store, co-owners with Mr. Strauss's brother Nathan. Isidore was a German immigrant. He came to the U.S. at age 9. He was very much the self-made man. He didn't start Macy's. He acquired it. They met in 1871, and they had 7 kids. Isidore served in Congress for a couple of years as a Democrat. I am drinking a bottle of Macy's water today in honor of Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. Here's what happened. Ida wouldn't get on the boat. She famously said to her husband, "We've been together all these years. Why should I leave you now?" And so he was then told that he could get in, but he refused, and he said, no, the younger men should go first. And the last thing they did was to put their maid aboard the lifeboat. And then they went and sat on deck chairs and held hands until the water swept them overboard. Yeah. One of the saddest shots in the James Cameron film is of the two of them. They'd gone back down to their stateroom, and they're lying on their bed comforting each other as the water rises. Oh, but that's not true. That didn't happen, at least not according to witnesses. Sorry?
That's supposed to be them.
Yes, that's Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. That's right. Sorry, they didn't make it. Sorry. All right. Thomas Andrews was the designer of the Titanic. Is Mr. Andrews here? Okay. Mr. Andrews was an apprentice at the Harland and Wolff shipbuilders in Belfast, where they built the Titanic. He began as an apprentice, and he worked his way up through every department. And so by this time, he knew everything there was to know about shipbuilding. And even though, you might say, well, he just didn't design it strong enough, or maybe he did, but there were too many other forces at work, he's usually portrayed as a good guy. He's usually portrayed as being very heroic in the movies, in the fictionalized accounts. In the Cameron film, he's played by a wonderful, versatile actor named Victor Garber. And you remember the moment where he gives Rose his life jacket because he doesn't want to use it himself. It is said that he worked very hard, waking passengers up, helping them get their life belts on. He helped to make sure that the lifeboats went out full, which unfortunately they didn't, but that's another story. We can talk about that too. And when all the lifeboats were gone, he started tossing deck chairs into the water just to give people something to hold on to. That's Thomas Andrews. I'm sorry. Yes, he did. He didn't make it. Now, if you're looking for a villain, this could be your guy. He usually is seen that way. Yes. How old was Thomas Andrews? Late 30s, I believe. Yeah. You know how it is. Everybody always looks older in those old photographs. Mr. Ismay was even younger. His father was the founder of the White Star Line, and Ismay had been in charge for about 12 years. He had done very well. He had a good mind for business, and the White Star Line was doing very well. Now, he's usually portrayed as the villain because there were witnesses who overheard him saying to Captain Smith, let's make this ship go as fast as it possibly can. Let's get into New York early, and let's get some good press as a result. Well, that wasn't a very good idea. Captain Smith did it anyway. Mr. Ismay wound up aboard the collapsible lifeboats, one of the collapsible lifeboats. There's talk that he shouldn't have wound up aboard any of the lifeboats, but he did. And later on, his career was ruined as a result. He was forced out of the White Star Line. He was savaged by the press. Everyone hated him so much that there was a town in Texas called Ismay, Texas. What do you suppose they did? They changed the name of the town, yes. And he kept out of the public eye for the rest of his life. Sad story. Look at him. He's even got the handlebar mustache, like a good villain.
Did you find out who in here was Ismay?
Did I? Is Mr. Ismay here? I guess I didn't want to embarrass him. Is Mr. Ismay present? Maybe it's better that he isn't, or he just doesn't want to show himself. Okay, look at that face. Yeah, Harold Bride was the junior wireless operator of the Titanic, and he was only 22 years old when all this happened. Is Mr. Bride here? Mr. Bride's not here? Shucks, he's my other favorite. I'll figure out what to do with this other bar of soap. Well, maybe I'll do that now. Ismay's not here. Andrews is not here. Mr. and Mrs. Strauss are here. Molly Brown's. I guess we better give Captain Smith the soap. What do you think? Oh, you are? You are here? I thought you were just being assertive. I'm here. Why not me? Sure enough. Okay. I think he was heroic because he kept on working. He kept on sending out those distress signals. He and the senior wireless operator, Phillips, even after Captain Smith said, you've done your duty, you can go, save yourself now, they kept on sending out those distress calls until they lost power. They sent out the old distress signal, CQD, and the brand new distress signal, SOS, and they kept on alternating back and forth between the two of them. In fact, he turned to Phillips and said, why don't you try that new SOS signal? It might be your last chance to send it. He thought he was joking. He wasn't. Phillips died in the lifeboat. By the way, trick question, what does SOS stand for? No, not that either. No, none of those. It stands for nothing. It was just an easily transmitted and easily recognized symbol. Dit, 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 da, 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 dit, dit, dit. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. Easy to send, easy to recognize. Now, Bride survived, but he was badly injured. His feet were twisted and frozen. But they hauled him aboard the Carpathia, and what do you suppose he did? Went right back to the wireless room and started sending out more messages to the families of the survivors. He kept deflecting the messages from the New York Times and other papers that said, give us a story. And instead, he focused on the personal. He got a big reception when he got back to New York. Mr. Marconi was there personally to congratulate him on his successful use of the Marconi wireless telegraph. And the New York Times was there with a check for $1,000 for his story, which he gave them. And he did testify at the inquests. But after that, he he quit the Marconi Company. He became a traveling salesman. And this is what I think is really interesting. He kept his identity secret, and even his wife and children did not know that he was that Harold Bride, the wireless operator aboard the Titanic. How he did it, I don't know. He could never do that now, of course. All right. And of course, many, many other interesting characters on this ship. A good story will have symbols. Again, a symbol is something small that represents something large, or something concrete that represents something abstract. Naturally, the ship itself is a symbol. It was a very big achievement for human beings, very strong, very beautiful, very fast, very complex, but it was a dud in its way. The iceberg is a symbol of sort of the opposite. The iceberg is nature. It was big, it was simple, it was not complex, but it won the showdown between iceberg and ship. And also what you may know about icebergs is that only about 1/8 of them is above the surface of the water. And so like many things and people in life, you see the top and you say, oh, that's not bad. And of course, you're not aware that a great deal more looms beneath the surface. And beneath the waterline is where the Titanic was damaged, although they knew they were up against something pretty bad. A lot of people like the orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley. Small, maybe 8 musicians, mostly string players. A couple of myths about the orchestra. Everyone thinks they were playing ragtime as the ship sank, which would have been ironic, but they were not. They were told to play light classical pieces just to keep people's spirits up. And then when things, right, good luck. And when things got very, very bad, they switched to hymns. Does anyone know of, wouldn't you? Anyone know the name of the hymn that they supposedly were playing as the ship went down? Yes, ma'am.
Michael, roll your boat ashore.
Camilla, that is inspired, absolutely. But no, yes.
I believe it was supposed to have been Nearer My God to Thee.
But, yeah, everyone thinks it was Nearer My God to Thee. This was nicely parodied in an early scene of the Simpsons movie. Check that out. But it wasn't. One person thought they were playing Nearer My God to Thee, and that's the story that got out. But more witnesses said the last piece they played was a hymn called Autumn. And they kept on playing until their chairs slid right down the deck. And so the orchestra is often seen as a symbol of dedication to one's work, dedication to art, and a symbol of the persistence of hope, the persistence of the human spirit, even under the worst conditions, which this certainly was. Okay. If you're really into this stuff, you're probably way ahead of me. But if you are somewhat intrigued by the Titanic and you want to know more, here are some really good resources. I want you all to go to Las Vegas and go to the Luxor Hotel. And this is all you're going to do there, of course. You're going to see the exhibit and come right back. You know that the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985. And since then, they have brought up the most amazing things. The Titanic artifact exhibit shows you stuff that you would expect, like luggage and dinnerware, jewelry, not the Heart of the Ocean pendant. We know that's still down there. Spoiler, sorry. Forget I said that. But they also show you stuff that you never thought would have survived, like letters and postcards. I think there's even some food matter down there that was just encapsulated enough that it didn't disintegrate. It's a very interactive exhibit. I saw this a few years ago at the California Science Center, and parts of it have gone to different cities, but a lot of it went to Las Vegas. It's very interactive. There's one part where they have a tub of water, which is chilled to exactly 28 degrees. And you are invited to stick your arm into that tub of water and keep it there and see how long you would hold out. Not very long. There are recreations of the staterooms and the grand staircase and the grand foyer, you know, with the clock. And the crown jewel of the piece is a 20-foot section of the hull of the Titanic. Of course, it's all rusted, it's all twisted. There's still glass in the portholes, but it's cracked. And there's a big sign that says, "Please do not touch." So, of course, I touched it. And my first thought was, very cool, I've touched the Titanic. And then the bad vibes started washing over me. So I sat on a bench and said about 5 Hail Marys, and I felt a little bit better after that. But I do recommend this exhibit. Now, as far as books goes, A Night to Remember by Walter Lord was written in the 1950s, and he interviewed 63 survivors. It's not the most factual book. It's been slightly discredited since, because it turns out that some of the survivors kind of embellished their stories to get a little attention. But overall, I still think it's the best. It's very complete, very detailed, and very readable. It reads like a novel. And this, of course, is the book that they made the movie out of in 1958. If you want to watch a DVD, I recommend Titanic, The Complete Story from the History Channel. Disc 1 is just the facts. Disc 1 is everything about the Titanic, starting from the plans and the building to the launch, the voyage, the disaster, the sinking, the rescue, and then the aftermath, the long-term aftermath included. Disc 2 is the legacy of the Titanic. The books, the movies, the jokes, etc. Okay. I'll show you one more slide, and then I have maybe time for a couple of questions. We have to be out of here at past, is that right? Okay, and then I'll tell you if you survived the voyage or not. This is just to show you. This is to just show you that we're not done with this story yet, and we won't be for quite some time. In addition to, I just discovered this a few weeks ago. It was very fortunate. In addition to the GPS, there's one other little mistake. Well, there's probably several, but there's one very glaring mistake on this cartoon. Can you spot it? Say it again, Mike. Where was the ship registered? Liverpool, right. I don't think you could have gotten a boat this size up the Thames River to register it in London. Okay, questions. I'll do my best. Yes, JC.
I just wonder whether there are lots of the treasures left in the ocean. You know?
There are still lots more down there.
Can anybody can go there and do it?
Oh, I knew someone was going to ask me this, and I don't really have the answer. There is a company called RMS Titanic Incorporated that seems to somehow have acquired the rights to whatever's down there, but that doesn't stop all sorts of pirates from going down there and getting the stuff themselves if they can. There's also quite a bit of disagreement as to whether we should bring this stuff up. Should it be treated like a grave site? Is this just common grave robbery? Or do we benefit from bringing up these artifacts and studying them? Peggy?
I just wanted to add to that, by chance I happen to know the guy who was on that ship that went down to the Titanic.
You knew a survivor?
Yeah, no, the guy that
Oh.
found the Titanic.
Would that be Mr. Ballard?
I'm sorry,
Would that be Bruce Ballard?
no, different name.
Okay.
But the point is that it takes extremely expensive equipment. You're so far down, they can barely get even staff to change it.
It's tricky.
And so, but he came back with some interesting things he found, but they are part of it. It's a very protected operation, and not anybody's going to have one of these ships
True.
to get there.
And that also reminds me, are any Titanic survivors still alive? The last one died about 1.5 years ago. Milvina Dean died. She was 9 months old when she was put on that lifeboat. Milvina Dean. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to miss this question. Is the exhibit in Las Vegas permanent or?
Probably not permanent, but it'll probably be there for a while. I was just on the phone to them this morning. It's going to be there a while. Yes.
I understood that most ships of this size, or near the Titanic size at this time, were fitted with what was called a double skin.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
it had two outside
Yes.
walls, and the
Yeah.
sevens with coal in between.
Mm-hmm.
And was the Titanic? I know the Titanic didn't
Yeah.
have a double skin. Was this because they were trying to save money, or I understood it didn't have a double skin?
I remember reading about the double skin, and I thought the Titanic did have it, so this is where my knowledge ends. But on the question of saving money, I would say, no, not much expense was spared to create this ship, so it probably wasn't to save money.
Andrews, the designer, had a scheme for putting double the amount of lifeboats.
And he didn't get it.
And again, they said, no, we'd rather spend it on furnishing.
I don't know if that's true or not. Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yes, sir.
I heard that the problem with the ship was the integrity of the metal was compromised.
This apparently is not true. There's a real good website, Titanic Myths, and it's Snopes approved. So I believe it. Maybe I shouldn't. But apparently this idea of the integrity of the hull was not a big deal. Yes, Rosario.
Did that necklace actually exist, or did James Cameron throw it in?
Was there some incredibly, impossibly precious jewel aboard the ship? We don't know of a necklace, diamond necklace like that. The most precious thing that everybody talks about was a jewel-encrusted copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, that poem, full volume poem. And don't ask me about the mummy. There was no cursed mummy aboard the Titanic. Please don't spread that rumor, okay? That's a big one, but no, it didn't happen. Okay, it's time to find out your fate. This is very easy. If your name appears in italics, if your name appears in curvy italic letters, you survived the sinking of the Titanic. If your name is in straight up and down Roman type, I'm very sorry. Once again, thank you for coming.